The Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Wallison, interesting to read your opening testimony. And in it you state that FSOC used the word significant 47 times in their 12-page statement designating Prudential as a SIFI. And being a litigator for 25 years, I know that when we have ambiguities, we try to look at the plain meaning of either the statute or the word to determine what was intended. And based on your extensive legal background, do you have any definition for the word significant that's being used?
No, sir. I have no definition for that.
And I guess my question is then how can these organizations that are under review for SIFIs anticipate whether they're going to be designated as such when we really can't get our hands around what significant means? I mean, as you point out, it's very arbitrary.
It's arbitrary. It's not a standard. It's not something that anyone can use to adjust. No firm can use to adjust its activities. There's really no information that is conveyed by that term.
So not only in the assessment of the organization, but then after the assessment or designation, if you will, other organizations, once Prudential is designated, then how can another insurance company, if you will, act accordingly to make sure that they're not so designated? There's no roadmap, in other words.
There is no roadmap. I mentioned before that the IAIS, which is an international insurance group,
right,
had set up a methodology for making this kind of determination, and they actually put percentage weights on things. That was a very valid way to proceed. That doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it, but it's a valid way to proceed. That was ignored by the FSB.
So organizations, a company today has no real roadmap to avoid being designated as a SIFI until it's too late.
That's right.
And when we look at the McCarran-Ferguson Act, which I think has been very good for this country for consumers' purposes in regulating insurance based on a state-by-state assessment, don't you foresee that there's going to be some serious conflicts there once an insurance company may be designated as a SIFI in trying to maintain certain capital requirements, either as risk-based capital versus GAAP accounting? How does that help the consumer?
This is pretty radical, what we're talking about here, and this is something that's never happened before, and that is that an entire industry will be bifurcated between those that are regulated at the federal level by the Fed differently.
Do they keep a separate set of books?
Well, in many ways, of course, but differently by the Fed with different capital requirements from the other similar, although smaller, institutions that are regulated at the state level. This will be a very difficult thing for people to understand.
And a very expensive thing.
And very expensive.
Mr. McNabb, just briefly, with regard to the Basel-type approach of capital requirements and applying it to asset managers, I mean, aren't we really just not only saying to asset managers what capital they can or cannot reserve, most likely they must reserve, but aren't we also just basically telling them what they can and cannot invest in?
I think that's one of the potential consequences of prudential regulation of asset managers is that we as asset managers could be put in a position of conflict where we're told for quote-unquote safety and soundness reasons to either invest in something or not invest in something when it's not in the best interest of the shareholders or in the prospectus that we've delivered to the shareholders.
And don't you foresee that leading to a new cause of action? I mean, if your fiduciary responsibility is to your clients, and now we've got this regulatory arm telling you what you can and cannot do, and basically who's your obligation to? I guess what I foresee here is that once asset managers are brought under this tent, I foresee in some of the creative ways a new cause of action being created that would lead to litigation and greatly increase that $108,000 assessment that now is going to be placed over the life of the investment, according to Mr. Eakin.
It's a very large concern.
One thing last, I understand that there's a genuine relationship between risk and return, and they're directly related. The higher the risk, the greater the return. But aren't we, what we're trying to do now is to eliminate any and all risk and as a result lower the return? If we're going to lower the return, how do we anticipate for retirement purposes and, more importantly, when you addressed for student loans, which is right now the largest liability that this country has?
Mr. Chairman, I think you make a good point in that there's a lot of confusion between what I would call idiosyncratic risk, which is the individual risk of a single fund or a single entity, versus systemic risk. And I think to other panelists' points earlier, there has not been a clear definition of what systemic really means versus what we all know as idiosyncratic today.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. Now recognize the young lady from